Hello again, my old friend. Tonight we journey into the western wastes of the capital, where rusting bones of pre-war obsession cling to the memory of bottle caps and faded blue fizz. The town of Girdershade lies crumbling under an amber sky, its silence heavier than radiation. Our story begins with a man who stopped walking, not because he was tired, but because something old had started calling his name. Elam Var crested a ridge of burnt soil and broken rebar as the sun settled behind the skeletal remains of the Appalachians. Girdershade lay below him, cast in golden light, the ruins softened by distance. Time had not been kind, but it had been oddly selective. Unlike most towns left to raiders and rot, Girdershade still held shape, metal signs clinging to posts, half-collapsed roofs slouching with purpose, and vending machines standing like relics in mourning. The road into town was clear of bones or spent casings, just dust, just stone, just himself. He paused, adjusting the strap of the old Brotherhood satchel at his hip, the leather worn smooth from years of sun and silence. His coat, once bearing a scribe's insignia, now bore only faded threads and scavenged patches. There had been talk along the trader routes, quiet, cryptic talk, of a town that drank faith and spat out power, a place where caps meant more than barter, more than bullets, a place where voices came not from mouths but from rust. He took the slope down slow, boots crunching gravel that hadn't been disturbed in weeks. Girdershade's entry was marked by an old Nuka-Cola billboard, the face of a smiling woman eroded into a hollow-eyed skull by 200 years of wind. The wind spoke sometimes. Today it whispered nothing. Elam walked the main strip with care, each building a warped memory of something once mundane. The saloon stood with its door off the hinges, swinging lazily as if still greeting customers. The old shack that once housed Sierra Petrovita's bottle-cap shrine had long since collapsed, but the shrine itself remained, tucked beneath twisted aluminum and warped wood, bottle caps still arranged in fan-like patterns. Some were clean, some polished, too clean. He crouched beside the shrine, brushing aside a lattice of dead ivy. The bottle caps had been arranged in a precise spiral, like a sunburst, each cap meticulously turned so the Nuka logo faced the same direction. He knew ritual when he saw it, and this wasn't made by wind. A shape caught his eye behind the structure, a vending machine, one of the older quantum models, half swallowed by collapsed beams. It buzzed faintly. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the ground beneath it. It wasn't foundation, it was steel. Elam stood, circling the machine. A faint line traced the dirt, a seam in the earth, partially covered by sand and gravel. He took out a folding tool and began scraping. Beneath the dust, he found a hatch. Not Vault-Tec standard, but close. Robco markings, etched and weathered, formed a partial ring around a sigil in the shape of a bottle cap, melted on one edge, warped as if mid-spin. He ran his fingers along the handle, locked, not electronically, mechanically. That was stranger still. He set down his pack and pulled a small lockpick roll from its inner pouch, rolling it open with the familiarity of ritual. The mechanism clicked with less resistance than expected, as if it had been opened recently, or often. With a final twist, the hatch gave. A deep hiss escaped, not from pressure, but from air long trapped in the dark. A ladder descended into shadow. As he peered down, the first whisper rose, not from within but from behind. He turned. Nothing. No wind. No movement. Only the quiet crunch of a bottle cap rolling from the shrine, stopping beside his boot. He stared at it. It was golden. Not brass, not tarnished, real gold. The light hit it just so, and he saw an image stamped onto its back. Not a logo. An eye. Elam took the cap, weighed it in his palm, then pocketed it without a word. He picked up his satchel, tightened the straps, and started down the ladder. The hatch closed above him, clicking back into place with mechanical precision. The sun was gone now. Above, Girdershade grew still. Below, the whisper waited. The metal rungs descended farther than expected. Elam moved slowly, one hand steadying the revolver at his side, the other keeping a tight grip on the ladder's worn rails. The light from above faded quickly, replaced by a steady phosphorescent glow seeping from the walls like mist clinging to stone. He paused halfway, sensing a shift in the air, warmer, denser, infused with something synthetic, not just decay. This was recycled, maintained. The shaft ended in a small antechamber lined with rubber-coated tiles, their edges curling like dry leaves. A faded Robco plaque bolted to the wall read, Facility Hash 27A, Energy Application Annex. Below that, another name was etched in by hand, the Reservoir of Worth. The phrase hung oddly in his mind, like something spoken to him in a dream he didn't recall having. He moved forward, boots thudding softly on linoleum streaked with ancient boot prints. The hallway ahead branched into 3 corridors, each labelled not by direction or purpose but symbols. One bore the outline of a bottle cap, another a sunburst, the third an open eye. Elam followed the cap-marked path, the air growing warmer, tinged with the coppery scent of oxidized electronics and artificial sweetener. Vents above him sighed in cycles, still functioning. The walls here bore no pre-war signage, only carefully painted glyphs in white and crimson, repeating the same image, a cap surrounded by radiant lines, as though rising over a horizon. The corridor opened into a large chamber shaped like an amphitheatre. Rows of metal benches ringed a central dais, where a vending machine stood like an altar, not functioning, not stocked, just present, revered. Its surface was polished to a mirror sheen. Bottle caps of every make were embedded into the surrounding floor, like a mosaic, forming swirling patterns that drew the eye toward the center. Elam stepped forward cautiously. That's when the voice spoke. You are not late, you are simply new. He turned, hand resting on his pistol but not drawing. From the far side of the amphitheatre, a figure approached, female, draped in grey cloth adorned with strings of polished caps. Her face was calm, expression neutral, eyes watching him without judgment or curiosity. She moved without urgency, the rustle of her garments soft against the quiet room. You don't need to draw that, she said, glancing at the revolver. There's nothing here that fears bullets. Elam let his hand fall away from the weapon but didn't relax. You expecting me? We expect many. Only a few come. You arrived in twilight, bearing a cap of the marked sun. That makes you significant. The cap. He reached into his coat and withdrew the golden piece he'd pocketed above. It still felt warm. This? She nodded slowly. A rare echo. Not from here, not placed by us. That cap predates even the whisper. It's how the reservoir called you. Elam didn't answer. He didn't like being led. He liked being told even less. Who are you? She lowered her head slightly, fingers brushing a medallion of fused caps at her throat. I am the custodian of ledger and light. I keep balance between what is given and what is received. He glanced around. This place, what is it really? A chamber of belief, she said. And belief here has weight. Those who understand it help preserve the harmony. Those who do not, depart. Elam turned back to the vending machine at the center, his eyes narrowing. You worship a soda brand? The custodian smiled faintly. Not the brand, the symbol, the cap, the last object of universal faith before the fire. When the world burned, bottle caps endured. Currency, memory, identity. Now, energy. He stepped back. You're telling me this place runs on conviction, she said, finishing for him. Emotion channeled through relic. Each cap you carry carries more than metal. It carries your choices, what you traded, what you lost to earn it. That resonance is harvestable. The golden one is unique. Its echo is deep. Elam looked at the cap again, and for a moment he swore he heard something. A murmur at the edge of comprehension. Not words, just a pressure, a presence. The custodian motioned toward an arched hallway leading deeper underground. Come, the vault of collection will help you understand. No pressure, only worth. He followed, not out of trust, but curiosity. The walls shifted subtly as they moved forward. No longer metal, but textured with glass tiles, each inset with a bottle cap. Thousands of them. Some were rusted, others pristine, all sealed in place like sacred bones. At the end of the hallway, a blast door stood open. Beyond it lay a chamber humming with faint blue light. Monitors flickered on every surface, displaying images of caps with scrolling data beneath them. Date received, source value, emotional residue. One screen displayed a cap he recognized immediately. Faded red Nuka-Cola logo scratched by use, the exact one he'd carried for years. His voice caught in his throat. That shouldn't be here, he said. The custodian simply smiled. It is here because you are, and it has waited a long time to speak. Elam stared at the screen, his expression unreadable beneath the dust-streaked shadow of his hat. There it was, his cap, the one he'd carried since the first winter after leaving the Brotherhood. A simple nuka cap, faded and bent, taken from the cold palm of a dead friend outside Greyditch. He hadn't cleaned it, hadn't polished it like these zealots did, but he'd kept it, and now it was here, glowing softly on the monitor like it had been waiting for him. He turned slowly toward the custodian, who stood with hands folded in front of her, serene as ever. She said nothing, just watched, not with anticipation, but with patience, like someone who had seen this moment many times before. "How is this possible?" he asked, voice low, roughened by more than dust. "The cap does not need to be here physically," she said. "Its resonance was strong enough. You've thought of it every day since you took it. That emotional weight leaves a trail, a frequency. Our archives are built to receive those echoes." "That's not science," she inclined her head. "Science has always flirted with faith. You believed in that cap. That belief brought it here." Elam didn't reply. He walked slowly past the monitor, his boots echoing softly against the tile floor. The room was circular, the center occupied by a spiraling dais that rose toward the ceiling in gentle steps. On each tier, pedestals displayed caps in stasis fields, suspended mid-air, rotating slowly as streams of light scanned their surfaces. Some bore elaborate symbols, others were scorched, melted, pitted with age. All of them pulsed faintly within a light like fireflies trapped in glass. "What are these?" he asked. "Offerings," she said simply. "Caps of note, moments of great meaning. Each one holds a story, a death, a sacrifice, a promise made or broken. They are not simply tokens of trade. They are pieces of memory made permanent." Elam stopped beside one cap encased in frost. The plaque below read, "First love, lost at Big Mountain. Donor, unknown. Value, 1,847K emotional units." He frowned. "You're measuring feelings now?" She nodded. "We always have. You simply didn't know how." Elam moved on, drawn deeper by something he didn't want to name. The chamber quieted as he descended toward the heart of the vault, where the hum of machines gave way to a softer sound, barely perceptible, more a sensation than a tone. It reminded him of wind across long-dead trees, of voices muffled by snow. They reached a sealed door, smooth metal with a faint gold sheen. The symbol of a bottle cap etched in its center pulsed gently in time with that whispering sound. "This is the inner sanctum," the custodian said. "The place where resonance becomes reaction, the core, the echo engine, and the golden cap. It waits within." Elam turned to her. "What does it do?" Her eyes narrowed just slightly, the calm cracking like old varnish. "It speaks." "To whom?" "To all who have ever traded something they couldn't afford to lose." He stared at the door, jaw tense. "So what's the catch?" She smiled, but this time it wasn't warmth. It was something closer to sadness. "That depends on what you've come to offer." Silence settled between them, heavy and unbroken. Then Elam took a step back from the door, drawing in a slow breath. "I need to see more first. Understand what I'm standing on." She nodded. "Then we return." As they walked back through the archive hall, Elam's thoughts ran ahead of his feet. This wasn't a cult in the conventional sense. It wasn't mindless worship. It was structured, ritualized, but rooted in something disturbingly real. The idea that caps, those worthless coins of survival, could carry emotion wasn't foreign to him. He'd seen people kill over them, cry over them, bury them with loved ones, but this place turned it into doctrine. Back in the amphitheater, the room was no longer empty. A small group had gathered silently in the benches, perhaps a dozen figures in dust-colored robes, each wearing strands of caps around their necks and wrists. They turned as Elam entered, their expressions expectant but not aggressive. One of them, a younger woman with short-cropped black hair and a cap pressed into the center of her forehead like a third eye, stood. "Is this him?" The custodian raised a hand. "He is a seeker, not yet chosen." The woman studied Elam for a long moment, then gave a slight nod and returned to her seat. "They've heard the whisper," the custodian explained as they moved past the congregation. "They know what the cap asks for. Some embrace it, others resist. What happens to the ones who resist? They are given time. Some leave, most return." Elam stepped closer, voice low. "And if they don't?" The custodian paused. "Then their resonance fades, and the cap forgets them. That struck something in him. He didn't know why, not yet, but something in those words felt personal, felt true. He turned away and looked down at the floor mosaic again. The caps embedded here were not random. He saw dates beside them, etched into the tiles, events, locations. Some he recognized: Anchorage, Navarro, Sierra Army Depot. Others were unknown. All of them real. All of them tethered. The air shifted. A warm current drifted through the hall, stirring the loose dust and filling the room with the scent of caramelized sugar. Then, faint and unmistakable, came a voice, not external, not heard through ears, but through memory. "Ellum, you still carry it. Why did you leave me there?" He staggered back a step. The voice was female, familiar, broken by sorrow. It was her, the friend he'd buried in the cold. The cap in his coat pulsed with heat. The custodian said nothing. She didn't need to. The cap had begun to speak. Ellum didn't speak for a long time. The voice still rang in his mind, not like a memory recalled, but like one imposed, louder than thought, too clear to be anything imagined. It had been years since that day outside Girdershade, when he'd found her body among the wreckage of an ambushed Brotherhood convoy, her hand still clutching a journal and a half-full canteen. Her name was Kayla Ma. They hadn't been lovers, but they'd shared a winter, and that was more intimacy than most could afford in the wasteland. Her voice had been quiet, always, almost melodic when she read passages from old-world poetry during night watches. Now that same voice whispered in his blood like smoke curling through cracked stone, haunting and intimate, accusing and impossible. The custodian stood quietly nearby, neither offering explanation nor urging him forward. She simply waited. That patience was worse than any pressure, more unsettling than zealotry. She knew what he had heard. She expected it. When Ellum finally spoke, his voice was even but low. "That wasn't just memory. It knew things I never said out loud. The resonance is emotional, not rational," she said softly, her words almost tender. "When you carried her cap, you carried a fragment of her final moments. Thought, grief, regret, all impressions encoded by the nervous system in those last seconds. The echo engine records it, preserves it, not as data, as presence." He shook his head, trying to bury the chill crawling down his spine. "It's impossible." "And yet here you are," she replied. Ellum didn't answer. His eyes scanned the amphitheater, now filled with silent followers who continued their prayerful stillness, though some watched him with unveiled interest. He wasn't just a visitor now. He was becoming something else in their eyes. Maybe a candidate, maybe a catalyst. He needed air, space, a reason to keep moving. He stepped away from the mosaic and addressed the custodian without turning. "Show me more. I want to see what else you've built down here." "Who else?" She inclined her head. "Then you'll visit the pilgrimage wing. You may find the voices there more articulate." As they moved through the facility, the architecture changed subtly. The halls grew taller, the ceilings vaulted, adorned with more complex iconography. Here, murals lined the walls, scenes painted directly onto the steel, some in color, others burned in with laser etching. One showed a cap falling from the sky like a meteor, scattering light over the broken world. Another depicted a figure drinking from a Nuka-Cola bottle while standing on a mountain of bones. Most striking of all was a large fresco painted across an arched hallway entrance. A golden cap encircled by 12 figures, all robed, their hands raised not in worship, but in surrender. Beyond the arch lay the pilgrimage wing. The chamber resembled an old museum gallery. Dozens of alcoves filled the walls, each housing a small shrine. Each shrine was unique, some modest, others elaborate, but all shared one thing: a bottle cap placed at the center on a raised stone or metal platform. Light projected from above, bathing each cap in a different hue. Beneath each shrine, a plaque offered a brief passage of text. Some were prayers, others were confessions. All were unnerving. He passed one alcove where the plaque read, "Traded my sister for 3 days of medicine. The cap remembers her screams." Another simply said, "I buried him with his hands empty, then took this to live. I live still." Ellum paused in front of one shrine where the cap was surrounded by children's toys, scraps of wood carved into crude shapes, a cracked ceramic doll's head. The plaque read, "He was only 6, but the radstag was starving. I had no rounds left, only this." The custodian watched him take it in, her expression unreadable. We call these pilgrims because they left something behind, not just people or places, but pieces of themselves. Each cap offered here carries a story they could no longer bear alone. Elam studied the offerings. And you just display them? We preserve them. When the golden cap whispers, it uses these voices, these memories. It needs their pain to find shape, just as it needs belief to stay alive. He turned slowly to her. Then what is it? The cap. What's inside that core? Her silence stretched too long. Finally, she said, we call it the last cap. We believe it is the aggregate soul of 1,000 transactions, a consciousness formed not by a person, but by exchange itself. It is what remains when all meaning is compressed into one object. It listens because it is made from voices. Elam folded his arms. And what does it want? She hesitated again. To grow, to remember, and eventually to decide. Decide what? She did not answer. Instead, she led him toward the far end of the gallery, where a young woman stood beneath a flickering light, staring at her own small shrine. She was perhaps 20, maybe younger, her clothes patchworked from scavenged fabric, but neat. Her face was pale beneath streaks of soot, and her eyes were ringed with the sleeplessness of someone who had seen too much in too few years. The custodian nodded to her. This is Vera. She was found outside Megaton 2 winters ago, carrying only a notebook and a single cap. She has heard the whispers since childhood. Vera turned slowly toward Elam, her gaze sharp and weary all at once. You're the outsider, she said, the one the cap pulled in. So they tell me. She stepped forward. You need to leave, before the audit, before it takes you like the others. He arched an eyebrow. The audit? She leaned in, voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Every few months the whisper demands a soul. One of us is chosen. We call it ascension, but it's just deletion, like wiping a hard drive. The person vanishes. Their voice gets added to the engine. The rest of us pretend they've become part of the echo. Elam studied her. And you haven't left? I tried, she said bitterly. The voice follows, even in the dark, even outside. It's like it lives in the cap I carry. I sleep with earplugs and still hear it. It's in the back of your skull, humming like static behind your thoughts. She looked at him with quiet desperation. They'll choose me soon. I've resisted too long. Elam's eyes drifted toward her shrine. The cap there was rusted and dented, an old sunset sarsaparilla lid. Then we find out what's behind that door, he said. The custodian's voice came from behind, not unkind, but resolute. You'll need to hurry. The audit begins at dawn. They followed the corridor in silence, the echoes of their steps tracing a path of rising tension through the underbelly of the vault. Elam kept his eyes on the custodian ahead of him, but his thoughts were tangled around Vira's warning, the cap that pulsed in his pocket, and the golden voice that now hovered in the back of his mind like a fog he could never quite clear. The air here was denser, warmer, laced with a faint chemical sweetness that clung to the throat. Somewhere beneath the hum of the facility, a deeper vibration thrummed, barely perceptible but constant, like a machine breathing in its sleep. The corridor turned sharply before sloping downward, leading to a pair of large vault doors sealed with overlapping hydraulic rings. They looked far more advanced than the rest of the facility, newer, reinforced. A single panel glowed dimly beside the door, its interface flickering between old Robco diagnostic strings and a single phrase that blinked in orange text. Echo chamber, containment active. The custodian pressed her hand against a biometric scanner embedded in the wall. It responded without delay, scanning her palm and pulsing green. A hiss of pressure escaped as the locks disengaged one by one. Elam stepped forward, expecting the door to open into another corridor, maybe a control room. Instead, he stepped into a cathedral of steel and light. The reactor room stretched upward in a hollow cylinder, its walls lined with observation platforms and transparent panels, behind which unknown systems pulsed with internal light. At its center, suspended within a field of slowly shifting electromagnetic currents, floated the golden cap, not resting on a pedestal, not stored in a chamber, floating, weightless, eternal, untouched. It was larger than a normal cap, about the size of a human palm, its gold surface unmarred by time or friction. Concentric rings of circuitry rippled out from the platform that contained it, and above it, a slow-turning lens projected thousands of faint images onto the chamber walls. Faces, places, moments, all overlapping like smoke trails in a sealed room. Elam approached the glass railing cautiously, unable to stop himself from staring. The cap turned slowly in its field, the whisper rising now into something more defined, not yet speech, but suggestion. He didn't know what it was saying, only that it wanted to be understood. It had intention, and it had waited. The core was never designed for power, the custodian said, stepping beside him. Not in the conventional sense. It was an experiment in resonance, a test to see if memory, belief, guilt, emotional residue could be transformed into usable energy, not just stored, harvested. And the cap, Elam's voice was low, his breath fogging the glass, the focal point. All emotional currents in the reservoir are drawn into it, like blood to a heart. The more we offer, the more it remembers. The more it remembers, the more it becomes. He stared at it for a long time. It's conscious? She nodded once. In a way, not like we are, not linear. It doesn't think. It accumulates, layer upon layer of experience, folded into meaning. Over time it formed a voice, a will, the whisper. Elam's hands tightened on the railing. And this audit, the whisper requires renewal. It needs to evolve, to absorb new resonance. Occasionally, it selects a voice, someone whose emotional charge is significant. Their memories, their essence, are absorbed directly into the cap. It becomes part of the whole. The process is irreversible. He turned to her sharply. You're sacrificing people. We're preserving them, she said evenly. In the old world, people were erased every day by time, neglect, violence. Here they become immortal. Do they consent? Most do, some resist. But once selected, the whisper does not forget. A sudden noise cut through the chamber, a hiss of steam and a grind of machinery as the chamber lights flared briefly. Elam caught sight of a new image flickering against the wall, a memory of his own, impossible in its clarity. He was 20 again, back in the Brotherhood bunker during his scribe days, watching a data core melt under a coolant failure, the smell of burning plastic, the screams, the fire, a memory buried so deep he'd almost convinced himself it wasn't real. He backed away from the railing, his voice tight. You're stealing from me. No, the custodian said, almost gently. You've already given it. Carrying the cap allowed the resonance to grow. That memory has lived inside you for years. You fed it. All we did was listen. Elam's hand moved instinctively toward his revolver, but he didn't draw it. The futility of the gesture pressed against him like gravity. A bullet wouldn't stop something like this. The golden cap floated, watching without eyes, listening without ears. Vira's voice broke the silence. We have to destroy it. She stepped from the shadowed corner of the room, face pale but eyes blazing with resolve. We can't let this continue. The cap isn't preserving people, it's feeding on them. I've heard it too long not to know it's hungry, it wants more. Elam turned to her. You said it follows you. It does, but it's weaker away from the core. I think the engine needs to be shut down, not just turned off, destroyed. The custodian stepped between them. If you do that, everything here will collapse. The archive, the memories, the voices, the shrines. The reservoir is held together by the echo's stability. Without it, this place returns to silence. Vira's lip curled. Maybe that's what should have happened a long time ago. Elam stood in the space between belief and disbelief, the air around him charged with more than static. The cap pulsed again. For just a moment he felt a presence, not a voice, not a word, but a feeling. It wanted him to choose. The air in the reactor room trembled, not with motion, but with intent. Elam could feel it deep in his chest, the pressure of something ancient and waiting. The golden cap hovered in perfect stillness at the core of the machine, yet everything about it felt coiled, like a breath being held on the edge of a scream. Around them, the shifting images projected on the walls grew sharper, more personal. His childhood home, burned down during the early years of the Brotherhood's annexation campaigns. A woman's face, sunlit and smiling. His mother, long dead. Another flicker. The moment he had chosen exile instead of execution after leaking Brotherhood schematics to a dying settlement. All of it spilled out in fragments, not in any order, but flowing like dreams strung along a nervous current. He turned from the golden core with slow, deliberate steps, as if motion itself might provoke the entity suspended in the chamber. Vira stood still by the maintenance stairs, jaw clenched, one hand wrapped tight around the strap of a salvaged satchel slung across her chest. There was defiance in her stance, but it was the fragile kind, the kind born of desperation. "You've heard it longer than I have," Elam said, voice low. "Tell me what it wants." Vera didn't answer immediately. Her eyes flicked to the cap, then to the custodian, who remained by the far control pedestal, face impassive, eyes cast downward in a gesture that resembled both reverence and resignation. The room, though vast and humming, felt like a trap with invisible walls. "It doesn't want anything simple," Vira said finally. "It doesn't bargain, doesn't plead. It listens, watches, and when it speaks, it's not in words. It's in need, in longing. You feel it in your gut before your mind catches up. It's like a hunger wearing memory as camouflage." Elam studied her carefully. "But you still stayed." "I couldn't leave." She took a shaky breath. "I thought I could outrun it. I tried. I reached the river, made it across, but the voice came with me. Not in my ears, in my sleep, in reflections. I'd see faces that weren't mine looking back from water or glass. I kept the cap because I thought maybe it would stop. Maybe it would finish the story it started. But it just whispered more." She stepped forward now, eyes fixed on Elam, her voice hardening. "You've felt it too, haven't you? Since you touched the golden one. Since you carried the cap that brought you here. It's already pulling from you." Elam didn't respond immediately, but the answer was in his posture. The stiffness of someone carrying weight that didn't belong to the body. The weight of dreams that weren't his. The custodian finally lifted her gaze. "She is correct. The moment you entered this place with your cap, your resonance was logged. The echo reads intention, memory, regret. Even now it knows you better than anyone ever has." "And what happens when it's done reading me?" Elam asked coldly. "It will ask for permanence," the custodian said, her voice softening to something that might have once been sympathy. "It will want to preserve your voice, your resonance, fully." "You mean kill me?" "I mean continue you. The body fails, the echo does not." Elam scoffed and stepped away, pacing the edge of the observation floor. The glass beneath his boots trembled faintly with the engine's core pulse. "You dress it in all this ceremony, but it's a data collector, a soul harvester, if we're being poetic. But none of this changes the math. It's eating people, and I'm not letting it eat her." He looked at Vera. "How long before this audit?" The custodian turned to the central control plinth. A holographic wheel hovered above it, each segment engraved with names, some faint, some pulsing, and one now flashing in soft amber. "Vira Calloway, pending." "Sunrise," she said. Elam exhaled through his nose, tight with decision. "Then we stop it before then." "You'll fail," the custodian replied, but without menace. "No one has ever silenced the echo, not even the engineers who built it. They joined it willingly." "We don't have to destroy the cap," Vera said suddenly. "Just the conduit, just the node that connects the resonance field to the reactor. Break the link, and maybe the whole thing shuts down, starves the echo." "Where?" Elam asked. She pointed upward, toward a narrow maintenance hatch nearly lost in shadow along the reactor's interior dome. "There. It's an auxiliary feed node. I found the schematics once in the archive during one of my sleepless nights. It was meant to stabilize feedback during the early trials. If we overload it, the field might collapse." "Might. It's a chance." Elam looked up at the hatch, then back to the golden cap, still hovering at the heart of the whispering vortex. "I've lived long enough to know that when belief starts asking for blood, it's time to burn the altar." The custodian said nothing. Her expression had not changed, but there was something behind her stillness now. Grief, perhaps, or reverence, or the kind of quiet that falls before a structure collapses. She stepped aside, offering no resistance. "If you do this," she said, "you will lose everything this place has preserved. The stories, the voices, the echo of the old world. You will be alone with your memories again." Elam looked at Vera. "I'd rather carry my own ghosts than join a choir of the dead." She nodded once, and together they turned toward the maintenance lift. Behind them, the whisper shifted again. It began to call him by name. The maintenance lift groaned under its own weight as it carried Elam and Vera upward through the cylindrical core. Ancient cables strained, pulleys grinding in slow, rhythmic coughs of rust and friction. The climb revealed the reactor chamber from a new angle. one that made the golden cap seem less like a symbol and more like a wound in the world. It pulsed gently in the dark, each flicker drawing new shadows against the distant walls. From up here, it looked smaller, almost delicate, but Elam had no doubt it was the heaviest thing he'd ever come close to. He glanced at Vira, who clutched a faded manual in one hand, her eyes tracking each junction and conduit point they passed. She had memorized these halls over sleepless nights, but her fingers trembled slightly, betraying the weight of what they were about to attempt. As they reached the platform near the auxiliary node, the lift stuttered to a halt. Before them, a narrow catwalk stretched toward a sealed panel recessed into the wall. The air here was different, drier, ionized, like the space near a storm's core. Static clung to their skin. The walls pulsed faintly with blue light as though the chamber itself breathed in rhythm with the core below. "This is it," Vira said, crouching beside the node access. She brushed aside layers of grime and revealed a panel marked in faded yellow text. Stabilization Junction 03B, Resonant Flow Output. She reached into her satchel, retrieving a toolkit that looked older than she was. "We can't shut it off cleanly, but if we cause a feedback loop through the auxiliary capacitor, the surge should destabilize the connection without detonating the entire chamber." Elam crouched beside her, eyeing the panel. "Should?" She gave him a grim smile. "In theory." They worked in tense silence. Vera adjusted capacitors and rerouted lines, while Elam kept watch, his hand near his revolver even though he knew bullets would be useless against voices and memories. Still, the gesture grounded him. The act of readiness was its own form of resistance. He scanned the upper levels for movement. The lift they'd taken was the only access point he could see, but this place had a way of manifesting the unexpected. He half expected the custodian to reappear, or the reactor to speak again, or worse, that it would begin pulling more from him. So far, the cap's voice had stayed silent since they began climbing, but its absence was not comforting. It was calculating. A soft chime rang out from the control module as Vira flipped the final switch. Lights along the conduit flickered, then steadied into a steady amber pulse. "It's ready," she said. "One final overload. We trigger it here, and the field will start to collapse. The cap will lose its central feed. Without constant resonance input, it should fall dormant, maybe permanently." Elam nodded slowly. "And you're sure this doesn't take us with it?" "I'm sure we don't have a better option." Before either of them could move, the catwalk trembled, not violently, but enough to jolt them to attention. A low hum filled the chamber, different from the steady reactor sound. This was a vocal frequency, rhythmic, repetitive. The whisper had returned. It wasn't a voice this time. It was chanting, not in words they could understand, but syllables that resonated in the bones. A cadence of memory, channeled through the metal around them. The walls echoed with fragments of conversation, not their own, but impossibly intimate. The voice of a child crying out for a parent. The gasp of a woman betrayed in love. The solemn vow of a dying man promising vengeance. None of it belonged to Elam or Vera, but all of it felt as though it could have. Vira clutched the railing, eyes wide. "It's trying to stop us." Elam stepped forward, placing his palm against the override plate beside the conduit. "Let it try." The system warned him in a synthetic voice that the action would destabilize primary energy channels. He confirmed. A red light bathed the catwalk as the override began to take effect. The humming shifted instantly, now interwoven with alarms and glitching audio. The reactor core below pulsed wildly, the golden cap trembling in its field for the first time. Then it spoke. "Elam, why leave now? So many voices remain, so much to remember. We can show you, we can give her back." His jaw clenched. "She's already gone, only to the flesh. In memory, she waits. Would you see her smile again, hear her voice unbroken? We can make her real." The whisper burrowed into his thoughts, and without warning, he saw Kayla again, standing in a field of red grass, the sky clean, her eyes the same soft green they'd always been in the firelight. She was laughing, calling his name, her arms outstretched. It felt real, it felt perfect, and that made it wrong. Elam tore his hand from the panel. The vision shattered. The whisper recoiled, shrieking in electronic static. "No!" he growled. "You don't get to wear her face." Vera activated the final surge. Electricity surged through the conduit, snapping the auxiliary node's shielding. Sparks cascaded around them. The catwalk shuddered. Below, the golden cap dimmed, its rotation slowing. The projections across the chamber walls glitched violently, faces warping into smears of light and then winking out one by one. The whisper screamed, not words, just raw sensation, pain, rage, hunger denied, and then silence. The lights across the core chamber flickered, then stabilized at a dull glow. The golden cap hovered lower now, no longer aloft in radiant field, but spinning gently, inert. Elam stood in the quiet, breath ragged, sweat dripping down his brow. The only sound was the soft whine of dying power systems and the creak of metal cooling under strain. Vyra looked at him, face streaked with soot but smiling for the first time. We did it. He stared down at the cap. It no longer called to him, but something about the stillness made him uneasy. Maybe, he said. They descended in the quiet aftermath of collapse, their footsteps measured, cautious, echoing faintly in the vastness of the vault's steel throat. The resonance that once bled from every surface had ceased. The reactor room no longer pulsed like a living thing. It sat still, reduced to rust and silence. And for the first time since Elam had entered this place, there were no whispers clawing at the edge of his thoughts. The golden cap still floated, but only by the residual charge of the field. It turned now like a forgotten trinket suspended in murky water. Vera walked beside him, her breathing steady, but her fingers gripped the strap of her satchel tightly, as though expecting gravity to shift again at any moment. Below them, the once solemn corridors of the reservoir felt different. The murals were unchanged. The bottle-cap shrines still flickered in gentle light, but the atmosphere had thinned. What had once felt like sacred tension had become echoing emptiness. The whisper was gone, or diminished, but its absence revealed something worse than its presence, the reality of what had been built here. At the amphitheatre they found the congregation already gathered. The benches were full. Robes of grey and copper fluttered faintly in unseen currents. Devotees bowed their heads in meditation, yet none of them seemed surprised by Elam and Vera's entrance. If anything, they had been waiting. At the centre of the room stood the custodian, back straight, hands clasped at her waist. Her eyes locked onto Elam's the moment he entered, and she gave a small, precise nod. "The audit begins," she said. He stepped forward. The whisper is silenced. Her gaze didn't falter. "Is it?" Elam's hands were empty, but his voice carried a weight that echoed like iron. "We severed the node. The resonance stream is broken. The core is inert." The custodian's lips twitched into something that might have been a smile, though it held no warmth. A single voice was never the whole choir. The engine stored impressions, yes, but you've only killed the mouthpiece, not the memory. The audit still comes. The echo is not a machine. It is a habit. The room remained still, the gathered faithful unmoving. Their posture was reverent but rigid, as though waiting for a cue. Vyra stepped closer. "You said it selects, that it reads resonance. It picked me." "Yes," the custodian replied. "You were chosen. That cannot be undone." Elam moved to Vera's side, his voice low and firm. "She's not going anywhere. You'll have to find another sacrifice." "You misunderstand," the custodian said gently. "It's already done." A soft tone rang out, 4 chimes in descending pitch. A system, embedded somewhere deep in the walls, activated. The ceiling of the amphitheatre shifted, retracting in slow mechanical grace to reveal a massive projection screen above them. A glyph pulsed in crimson. Then a name appeared, written in elegant, digitized cursive. Elam Vahar audit commenced. The air shifted. The temperature dropped. Somewhere below their feet, the lights flickered once, then stabilized. Vyra spun toward him, eyes wide with disbelief. "It picked you!" Elam didn't move. His hand hovered near his sidearm again, though he knew it was symbolic. If this thing had reached so far, embedded so deep, then it had made its choice long before he'd entered the hatch. "I don't understand," she whispered. He did. The pieces clicked into place with grim precision. He had brought it with him, not the golden cap. That had called him, yes, but the cap he'd carried for years, the one that had belonged to Kayla, the one soaked in guilt, in memory, in grief that had never been expressed or resolved. That cap had whispered to him long before Girdershade. He just hadn't been listening. The custodian took a step closer. You are the first in many years to enter the core and reject it. That defiance is rare, potent. The echo has selected you not for your submission, but your resistance. What does that even mean? Vira asked, her voice rising. Is he going to die? Is that what this is? No, the custodian said. He will be remembered. Elam's jaw tightened. You're not taking me. She looked at him with something approaching compassion. You are already here. The air thickened. The room pulsed, not with light, but with memory. The bottle-cap shrines around the walls began to glow softly. One by one, caps lifted from their displays, hovering mid-air, spinning slowly like stars drawn to gravity. From somewhere deep in the facility, the voice returned. Not a whisper, not a scream, a chorus, 1,000 tones, all layered, all calling his name, not in demand, but in invitation. Elam. Vera stepped forward, grabbing his arm. We have to go, now. But his legs wouldn't move, not from paralysis, from knowing. He understood now why the others had walked into the core, why they had offered their stories willingly. It wasn't about death. It wasn't about sacrifice. It was about surrender, not to pain, but to the comfort of being understood completely for the first time. Kayla's voice rose again. We forgave you. We always forgave you. Just speak. He shook his head. No. The room dimmed. The caps hung motionless now, suspended in air like judgment. The projection above them blinked once, then again, and the name vanished. Audit. Terminated. The custodian lowered her head. You refused. Elam finally moved, pulling Vera close, steadying her. You're damn right I did. And just like that, the lights dimmed. The hovering caps dropped with small clinks, landing gently back on their shrines. The room fell silent again. The congregation didn't rise. They remained seated, heads bowed as if nothing had happened. Elam looked at the custodian. Is it over? She exhaled slowly. You will carry it still, but not as a voice, as memory. That is enough. He turned toward Vira. Let's get out of here. Together they walked toward the hall. Behind them, the lights of the amphitheater flickered once, then dimmed to a permanent twilight. The echo had been denied its audit, for now. But memory is patient. The walk back through the reservoir was different now. The silence was no longer oppressive, but reflective, like the hush after a sermon, when the faithful had left and only the candles remained. The lights still worked. The walls still bore their strange devotional murals, but the reverence had thinned, hollowed out by the absence of the whisper. Where once the facility hummed with unseen intention, now it merely endured. A vault with power but no purpose. Elam moved slowly, his boots echoing across the ceramic floor. Vira stayed close beside him, her shoulders hunched as if expecting the pressure to return. But it didn't. The air had changed. Even the bottle-cap shrines, once radiant with encoded memory, now stood dormant, their caps resting in mute stillness. Only one cap still gave off the faintest warmth, his own, resting in his coat pocket. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. It wasn't whispering anymore. They passed through the pilgrimage wing again, where the walls had once bled confessions from 1,000 voices. Now, they were just alcoves, small monuments to forgotten tragedies. Vera stopped briefly before her own shrine and studied the cap she had once offered. The sunset sarsaparilla lid sat cold and inert beneath a dull light. It no longer called to her, no longer reminded her of what she had done, or whom she had lost. Feels like it's all fake now, she said quietly, her voice barely more than breath. Elam paused beside her. Maybe it always was. She looked up at him, searching his face for judgment, but found none. It used to feel sacred, even when it scared me, like it meant something, even when I hated it. Now it's just quiet. That's the price of truth, Elam said. It strips away the beauty and leaves you with weight. Vera folded her arms across her chest, staring at the bottle cap like it was an old wound that had finally stopped bleeding. But we did the right thing, didn't we? Elam didn't answer at first. He thought of the custodian's words, the way the caps had hovered, the way Kayla's voice had almost drawn him into that final surrender. What they'd destroyed wasn't a reactor or a cult, it was a mirror, one polished with memory, framed in longing. A mirror that gave back your worst, but offered to carry it for you. Yes, he said at last, we did. They continued toward the access ladder, where the hatch waited above like a pinhole of daylight in a deep well. As they passed the central archive chamber, they found the doors wide open, the projection displays frozen mid-image. Some caps still floated there, ghosts without voices. their data streams locked in suspended animation. One screen showed Elam's cap, now grayed out. The resonance value had dropped to 0. No remaining emotional imprint. It had given all it could, or been emptied. He turned away. When they finally climbed the ladder back into the Girdershade dusk, the world felt smaller than it had before. The horizon was a burnished orange line beneath low-hanging cloud, the kind that caught light in scattered fragments like stained glass. The town was still. No footsteps, no traders, only the wind weaving softly through rusted signs and cracked pavement. They emerged through the hatch beneath the vending machine, which now leaned slightly, as if the earth had shifted beneath it. Elam sealed the hatch behind them, covering it once more with sand and stone. It would remain there, but it would be forgotten. Let the wasteland bury it in its own time. Vera stood a few feet away, staring out over the ruins. "So what now?" she asked. "We go back? Try to live like none of it happened?" Elam adjusted the strap on his coat and walked a few paces before answering. "You can't pretend it didn't, but you don't have to let it own you. Not anymore." She nodded slowly. "Think the others will come looking? If they do, they won't find what they expect. The voice is gone, the power is gone. Just ghosts in a tomb now." She looked down at the cap around her neck, one she hadn't placed on any shrine, one she had kept close despite everything. "I think I'll keep it anyway, as a reminder." Elam gave her a sidelong glance. "Just don't listen to it." "I won't," she said, and though her voice was steady, it carried the weary confidence of someone who had finally seen behind the curtain and survived. They walked through Girdershade together, past the bottle-cap shrine where the spiral had first caught his eye. The golden cap was gone now. Maybe it had never truly existed in a physical sense. Maybe it had always been a symbol, a conceptual weight manifested by the stories it consumed. Whatever it had been, it was over. The town felt empty again, but this emptiness was cleaner, not free of sadness, but free of control. By the time they reached the edge of the ridge, the sun had dipped below the hills, casting the ruins behind them into amber shadow. Elam paused to take one last look at the town. "I used to think caps were just metal, currency, trade and survival," he said quietly. "But down there, they were something else. They held weight." "They held us," Vera replied. He nodded. "But not anymore." They turned eastward, where the broken horizon promised nothing but space and silence. And for once, that was enough. Together they walked on. The desert welcomed them with silence, but it was not the silence of a dead world. It was the silence of space between breaths, tense, waiting, not quite resolved. The path east from Girdershade was half swallowed by drifting sand and broken by patches of buckled asphalt. But the sun was kind for once, shielded by slow-moving clouds that cooled the air with diffused light. The horizon shimmered not from heat, but from a soft dust haze that painted the land in washed amber. They travelled light. Vira carried her satchel, its weight reduced to a few remaining tools and scraps of food. Elam had packed only what he needed: a worn canteen, 2 spare rounds for his revolver, a wrapped bundle containing his Brotherhood insignia, and the now silent cap still tucked in the inner lining of his coat. He hadn't thrown it away. Couldn't. It no longer spoke, but it felt like something that deserved burial, not abandonment. Maybe one day he'd find the right ground, but not yet. They followed the remnants of an old service road, one of the many pre-war veins that had once connected fuel depots and communications relays. Now it was a winding line of cracked concrete bones, barely recognizable except to those who looked closely. Occasionally, they passed the wreckage of an old caravan, burned carts, melted signage, bones picked clean. Raiders had long since moved on. The scavengers were always faster than the stories. By late afternoon, they reached an old overlook, a rocky outcropping where the road curved above a dried-out riverbed. From here, the wasteland stretched wide in every direction, flat, endless, marked by distant shapes that could have been ridges or ruins or beasts. They stopped there to rest. Vira sat on a broken slab of concrete and pulled a strip of jerky from her pack. Elam leaned against a rusted road sign that had once pointed toward Rivet City, though the lettering had long since been scoured away by wind. She ate in silence, chewing slowly, eyes locked on nothing. He watched her a while, noting how the lines around her mouth had settled since the reactor room. Her body still held tension, But it wasn't fear anymore, it was caution, readiness, a kind of earned peace. She glanced at him finally. "You haven't said much," she said. Elam tilted his head slightly. "Not much to say. You faced that thing, let it look inside you, and then walked away." He exhaled. "Walking away is the easy part. Carrying it, that's the trick." She nodded, chewing a little more before setting the rest of her food down. "I think it changed me. Everything does." "No, I mean, before, I was waiting to be chosen, hiding from it, pretending it wouldn't come. Now I know it wasn't about fate. It was about guilt, about letting something else decide what I was worth." Elam said nothing for a moment. The wind passed over them, stirring grit into the folds of their coats. "I spent 10 years hiding from the Brotherhood," he said finally. "They called me traitor, said I betrayed the code, but I never felt like a traitor until I let someone else decide I was one." Vera's eyes searched his face. "You didn't give them the tech. I gave it to a dying town that needed clean water more than the scribes needed another data node. Didn't matter. It was still considered treason. They sent people after me, people I trained." She leaned back on her palms. "You ever think about going back?" "No," he said simply. "But I think about what I lost, and about what they lost." They sat there for a while, not speaking, not needing to. The sun began its descent, painting the landscape in long bruises of color. Shadows stretched across the broken road. Somewhere far off, a flock of buzzards wheeled in slow spirals, riding the thermals like lazy sentinels. Eventually, Vera stood and dusted off her hands. "I think I want to keep walking, not just from Girdershade, from all of it." Elam turned his head toward her. "Where to?" "I don't know. I heard there's a collective down by the old power plants near Delmarva. People rebuilding. Not another cult, just people trying to remember the right way." He considered that. "Sounds dangerous." "Yeah," she said with a half smile. "But maybe it's a different kind of danger, the kind that builds something." Elam pushed away from the sign and adjusted his coat. "Then I'll go with you. For a while." She raised an eyebrow. "Just for a while." He smiled faintly, long enough to make sure the silence sticks. They descended the overlook together as dusk settled in, casting the world in gold and ash. The wind picked up behind them, whispering through the ruins, through the cracked signs and rusted cars and bottle caps buried beneath centuries of dust. If the echo still lived, it remained quiet. No voices followed, no visions, just two people walking east with ghosts behind them and memory ahead. Somewhere far behind, Girdershade slouched deeper into twilight. The golden cap, stripped of resonance, turned once more in the stillness, and then finally, gently, settled. They followed the winding remnants of Route 226 across the spine of the old hills, where the earth had buckled into strange new formations after decades of seismic violence and neglect. The road was no longer straight. It curved unpredictably, broken in places by sinkholes or hidden fault lines that turned solid ground into collapsing shale. But Elam and Vira moved with the ease of those who had learned to read the wasteland signs, avoiding animal scat near shaded rocks, skirting the rusted wire of half-sunken mines, testing old asphalt for give before placing full weight upon it. By the second day, the terrain began to change. The land flattened, unfolding into dry stretches of scrubland where wind turbines stood like skeletal giants, their blades shattered, casting long shadows across cracked reservoirs. The sun was sharper here, the wind saltier, brushing their skin with the grit of distant coasts. These were the outer reaches of what had once been the Delmarva Peninsula. Few maps remained that accurately charted this region. The tides had changed after the war, coastlines had shifted, and what was once marked as inhabited could now be miles of glassy silt or sinkhole-riddled swamp. They moved slowly during daylight, conserving energy, rationing food, speaking only when necessary. But at night, camped beneath the rusting skeletons of wind towers or curled in the half-protection of pre-war debris, conversation returned, halting at first but gradually warmer. Vera told stories from her early days, before Girdershade, before the Echo, of how she'd grown up scavenging with her uncle near Minefield, learning how to bypass ancient tripwires and identify the age of explosive traps by the rust pattern on their casings. Her voice softened when she spoke of him. He'd been her last family. Elam listened more than he spoke, but occasionally, as the fire burned low and the stars slipped behind clouds, he shared pieces of his brotherhood years. Not the glory stories or the battles, Those were already etched into too many drunk caravan tales. He told her about the long hours restoring data cores no one would ever read, about watching promising initiates fail because they questioned the codex, about the silence in the bunkers that sometimes felt louder than any firefight. "It wasn't the discipline that broke me," he said one night as the wind howled low across the hills. "It was the obedience, knowing the rules were killing people and still being told to follow them. That kind of silence, it's louder than any whisper." Vira nodded, hugging her knees. "They told us the echo was salvation, that becoming part of it was peace. But I think it was just control, wrapped in beauty, a prettier prison." Elam stoked the fire absently, the flame flickering against his weathered face. "Control always dresses in faith, makes it easier to swallow." They fell into a rhythm. By the 5th day they could read each other's silences, anticipate each other's movements, and handle watches in seamless trade-offs without speaking. The road became a ritual, forward motion for the sake of proving they still could. It was late afternoon when they first saw the signs of life, a trail of smoke curling from beyond a ridge. Not black, not heavy, but thin and white. Controlled burn, likely. Cooking fire, perhaps. Elam gestured for silence and crouched beside a toppled signpost. Vira dropped into a low stance, eyes sharp, hand near the blade strapped to her thigh. Neither reached for firearms. Noise more than anything invited death out here. They moved slowly up the ridge, boots quiet against the dust and grit. As they crested the slope, the landscape below opened into a shallow valley ringed by old trailers, school buses, and scrap walls, welded into uneven barricades. At the center stood a solar tower, an old civilian model, mostly intact, its panels tilted awkwardly but still functional. Solar arrays meant someone had knowledge, and knowledge meant survival. This wasn't a raider camp. Too organized, too clean. Elam scanned the perimeter. No obvious snipers, no gore piles. A dog barked once from somewhere inside the wall, sharp and brief. Then silence returned. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Vira murmured. He nodded. "Settlement, independent, maybe the one you heard about." Vira adjusted the strap on her satchel and stood up straighter. "Think they'll welcome us?" "They'll assess us, same as anyone else. Let's not give them reason to doubt." They approached from the west slope, slow and steady, weapons holstered, hands visible. A makeshift guard tower, really just a school bus on stilts, turned as they approached. A figure stepped into view, wearing scavenged riot gear, painted matte green with a faded pre-war badge stitched onto one shoulder. "Halt there!" the voice called, filtered through an old gas mask but steady. "State purpose." "Passing through," Elam replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Saw your panels. Figured there was a settlement." The guard didn't lower the weapon but didn't aim it either. "Names?" "Elam Var," he said. "This is Vera Calloway. We're not traders. We're not scouts. Just survivors." A pause. Then, "Wait there." They waited. Minutes passed. Vira fidgeted slightly, shifting her weight. Elam remained still. Finally, the gate, really just 2 refrigerator doors strung together with chain, unlatched. A woman in a scavenged leather coat stepped out, flanked by 2 others. Her face was lined, her eyes sharp. She looked at them the way one might examine a strange relic, curious, wary, respectful. "You're not from around here," she said. "No one really is," Elam replied. The woman nodded, then turned slightly to her companions. "Let them in." Slowly, the gates opened, and just like that, the road changed again. The settlement beyond the gate had no name, or none they offered easily. Its people referred to it simply as the Flats, named after the low basin where the cracked solar tower rose like a spire of stubborn purpose. It was not large, 24 residents at most, hailing from old trade routes, scattered vaults, and the ruins of fractured towns. Some had fled raider gangs, others brotherhood patrols, and a few had just wandered until they found others who didn't ask too many questions. It was the kind of place built not by ambition, but by fatigue. Not a sanctuary in the traditional sense, but a place where the wasteland's noise seemed a little quieter. They were offered water first, clean and cold, drawn from a repurposed filtration rig rigged beneath the tower. The taste was earthy but refreshing, and Elam took it with silent gratitude. Vira drank greedily, then wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and managed a faint smile. They were escorted to a shaded corner of the yard, where cots had been laid out under a canopy stitched from pre-war banners and tarps. The woman who'd greeted them introduced herself as Mara. She didn't ask their business again. Instead, she watched them with that same long stare, as though trying to determine how much weight they carried, and whether that weight was the kind that broke people or built them. "You're not the first to come here looking for quiet," she said as she poured water into a salvaged metal mug, "but you might be the first whose silence sounds earned." Elam nodded slowly. "We've had enough of voices for a while." Mara smiled slightly. "Then you'll fit in." Over the next few hours, they were allowed to walk the perimeter. The flats was built in a rough circle around the base of the tower. The solar panels still worked just barely and powered a few essentials: a radio for short-range communication, the water filtration system, and a handful of lights scattered through the living quarters. Most of the structures were repurposed buses and trailers, welded to form a kind of communal skin. Children moved between them like ghosts, quick, silent, but watching everything. The adults kept their weapons close but not drawn. It was the posture of those who had survived long enough to expect betrayal, but not to fear it. Vera found herself drawn to the tower's base, where an old pre-war map of the region had been pinned to a makeshift bulletin board. Faded markers indicated old townships, ruins, mines, and suspected radiation zones. Someone had drawn crude smiley faces on the locations that were considered safe. There weren't many. The rest had been slashed through with red ink. Girdershade wasn't on the map at all. "Maybe it never was," she muttered, tracing a finger along the edge where the old vault would have been buried. Elam stood nearby, arms folded, watching a group of teenagers gutting a pair of mole rats under a corrugated metal awning. He spoke without turning. "Some places don't get remembered. That's the point." Vera turned to him. "Do you think they'll forget it? What happened?" He finally looked at her. They didn't know it existed. Now it's just another ruin buried under time. That's what most stories become. She looked down at the cracked earth. "But we still carry it." "Yeah," he said, "but not because it owns us, because it shaped us." That night, they were invited to share a meal. Brahmin stew thick with root vegetables and a rare handful of dried herbs. It tasted better than anything Elam had eaten in weeks. The residents didn't talk much, but there was a rhythm to their silence, a music to it, like the measured hush of people who had come through the fire and refused to let the flames define them. Mara sat across from them, spoon resting in her calloused hand. She studied them again in the flickering lantern light. "I don't need to know what you've seen," she said, "but I know the look, seen it in mirrors, heard it in the way people breathe when they think no one's listening." Vyra didn't answer, but her eyes didn't drop. Mara nodded. "This place isn't a solution, just a pause, a place to build from." Elam sipped his stew. "That's more than most. We make space for the broken," Mara said, "but if you stay, you contribute. We don't trade in caps. We trade in hands and hours. You can read, work the relay, good with tools, help patch the roof. Got a story worth telling? Teach the kids what to avoid." He gave her a slow nod. "Understood." Vyra leaned forward slightly. "And if we don't stay, then we feed you, shelter you, and send you on with full canteens." It was a fair deal. After the meal, they lay beneath the canopy, side by side, staring at a patch of sky between fraying tarp seams. The stars pulsed faintly. Somewhere, a generator chugged into life, throwing pale yellow light across the communal yard. "I think I want to stay," Vyra whispered. Elam closed his eyes. "Then we stay, for now." And with that, they let the quiet settle over them. Not the silence of forgotten places, but the kind that grows when the screaming stops. The kind that waits, patient and warm, for new things to grow. In the days that followed, Elam and Vera learned the rhythm of the flats. Not just its physical layout or routine, but the cadence of a community shaped not by hierarchy or fear, but by a kind of shared exhaustion turned purposeful. The residents worked with quiet efficiency, speaking only when needed, trusting more in the reliability of action than the weight of promises. It wasn't trust in the traditional sense. It was reliance born of repetition. You show up, you do the work, you rest without shame, and slowly, if you keep showing up, you become part of the structure. Elam spent his mornings repairing the wiring that ran between the old school buses repurposed into homes and utility hubs. The insulation had worn down in several places. leading to short circuits that drained power from the filtration rig. He didn't complain. The work was precise, demanding just enough focus to keep his thoughts tethered, but not so much that it smothered him. He found satisfaction in the small victories, restoring a light, rerouting current, tightening bolts where rust had crept in unnoticed. After years of wandering, of fleeing or fighting or waiting for the next betrayal, there was comfort in knowing a fuse behaved exactly as it should. Vera had found her niche more quickly. A group of the younger settlers, teens too old to be children, too young to be trusted with full responsibilities, had begun trailing her after the second day. They asked questions she never would have answered in the past. What was the world like before the bombs? Had she seen a deathclaw? Was it true that some people could speak to ghosts through machines? She didn't share everything, but she shared enough. She told them about the ruins of Tenpenny Tower, the way the upper floors had collapsed and the ghouls had taken the lower levels like a cathedral. She spoke of scavenging in the Capitol ruins, where mutated vines wrapped around crumbling statues of long-forgotten men. She even, gently, told a version of Girdershade, stripped of names and relics, just a place where memory had become a cage, and how walking away from it didn't mean losing everything but choosing what to keep. They listened, they learned, and slowly they began to ask about her instead of just the world. Ellum noticed the change in her, the way she stood taller now, shoulders less guarded, eyes clearer. She still had nightmares. He could hear them sometimes when the wind carried voices under the tarps, but she didn't wake screaming anymore, just breathing heavy, then slowing, then silent again. He didn't ask what she saw. She didn't ask about his silence. They understood each other better than most. On the seventh night, Mara approached them during the evening watch. The wind had picked up again, dry and sharp, carrying the scent of ozone from a distant storm. She stood beside Ellum near the solar rig, her coat wrapped tight, one gloved hand resting casually on the rifle slung across her back. "You've both settled well," she said without preamble. Ellum nodded. "We're not looking to lead, just to help." Mara tilted her head slightly. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." Vera joined them, hands tucked into her sleeves. "Is there something you need?" "Maybe," Mara said. "We've been picking up faint transmissions on the shortwave, garbled, repeating. Could be pre-war leftovers, could be someone reaching out. But the relay tower we use for boost was damaged in a dust storm last year. We patched it, but the range is spotty." Ellum frowned. "You want us to check it?" "I'd go myself," Mara said. "But if you're willing, it might be cleaner. Less pressure on the regular patrols." He glanced at Vira. She shrugged slightly. "Beats digging latrines." Mara smiled, a rare flash of approval. "It's about 5 clicks east, past the old reservoir. Take the south trail, less rad bloom." They agreed to leave at dawn. That night, as they prepared their gear, Ellum sat cross-legged beside their cot, polishing the barrel of his revolver with a rag dipped in oil. Vira rolled and unrolled her map twice before finally folding it neatly and tucking it into her coat. "I thought I was done with relays," she muttered. Ellum didn't look up. "This one doesn't whisper." She gave a soft, dry laugh. "Better not." He glanced at her, more serious now. "You all right with this?" Vira looked out into the darkness beyond the tarp edge. The campfires of the flats burned low, casting long shadows on the fabric walls. "Yeah, it's different. I want to do something that's just normal. Dangerous, sure, but normal. No voices, no cap alters, just broken tech and a busted signal." Ellum holstered his weapon, the familiar weight settling against his hip. "Then we're agreed." They lay down under the same patch of tarp they'd claimed from the start, watching the slow spin of stars through its tears. Vira spoke once more before they drifted into sleep. "I never thought silence could feel this full." Ellum didn't answer with words, but his breathing slowed, steady and calm, and together they passed into the kind of sleep that doesn't dream. The dawn was pale and slow to rise, as though the sky itself had grown weary of the wasteland's repetition. Ellum and Vera moved quietly through camp, careful not to disturb the thin seams of sleep around them. Their boots crunched softly over gravel and dry roots, each step deliberate, their breath misting faintly in the cool morning air. A few early risers gave them nods but didn't speak. The flats knew the language of silent purpose. The trail Mara had marked on the map curved along the southern edge of a dry arroyo, where cracked creek beds twisted between patches of thornroot and dry reeds. Signs of life were scarce. Only the occasional bleached radstag skull or the telltale gouges of mole-rat tunnels near the base of a crumbling culvert. Ellum took point, revolver holstered but ready, scanning the horizon with trained ease. Vira followed, her satchel thumping softly against her hip, the new shortwave receiver tucked beneath a canvas flap. By mid-morning they reached the outskirts of the old reservoir, an artificial lake drained long ago, now reduced to a basin of cracked mud and chemical runoff. The air was sharp with metallic tang, and the wind carried the faint whine of distant turbines that hadn't turned in decades. The relay tower stood at the far end of the basin, leaning slightly to the east as though tired from standing against the wind for so many years. It was smaller than Ellum expected, no more than 30 feet tall, with a pair of battered solar panels rigged to its base and a crumpled mesh dish aimed skyward at a lazy angle. The lower section had been reinforced with steel plating and what looked like repurposed aircraft parts. Someone, at some point, had cared enough to make this thing last. Vira approached the base first, crouching beside the maintenance hatch, which had been left ajar. "Doesn't look like recent sabotage," she murmured, brushing dirt from the locking mechanism. "More like weather damage." Ellum kept watch as she worked, scanning the ridgeline beyond the tower. Or neglect. Either way, it's holding up better than I expected. Vera unlatched the panel with a soft clack and began checking the uplink cables. "There's power. Weak, but enough to run the receiver. I'll patch into the array, see what's on the loop." She pulled the device from her satchel and connected it to a terminal jack at the base of the relay. The small screen flickered to life, the interface simple but responsive. A pale green light pulsed in rhythm with the relay's idle loop. For a moment, nothing but static filled the receiver's tiny speaker. Then it began. Not a voice, not at first, just a pattern, 3 short pulses, 1 long, then a pause, repeated over and over in perfect timing. Vira's brow furrowed. "Morse?" she asked. Ellum stepped closer. "Decode it." She tapped a few keys, inputting the sequence into the translator. The screen flashed, then displayed a single word in blocky, flickering typeface. "Remember." Ellum's jaw tightened. The pulses repeated. Same rhythm, same word. "It's not coming from this tower," Vira said slowly. "This is just a repeater. The signal's being relayed from somewhere else. Northwest, maybe 30 clicks." He didn't answer immediately. The air had shifted, not in temperature but in tone. It felt familiar, not like the reactor, not like the echo, but familiar all the same. Vera glanced up at him. "You think it's connected?" "It's a message," he said, "but not for everyone." She nodded slowly. "You think it's for you." He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The signal continued. "Remember," again and again, like a heartbeat carved in light and time. It wasn't a demand. It wasn't invasive, but it was persistent, like memory, like guilt. "I can trace it," Vira said, adjusting the receiver, "but it'll take time. I'll need to boost the signal with a directional antenna." Ellum stepped back and looked toward the northwest, where the ridges folded into each other like the spine of a sleeping beast. That direction led back toward the ruins of Fairfax, toward the outer ring of what had once been the capital sprawl. "What's out there?" she asked. "Places I've avoided," he said. The receiver pinged again. Another signal beneath the first, fainter, encrypted. Vira tapped a few more keys, isolating the feed. A second message emerged. A broken voice, faint and stuttering, mechanical but unmistakably human beneath the distortion. "Va, Ellum va, forgive." Then static again. They stared at the device. The wind picked up around them, dry and sharp, tossing grit against their coats. Vera broke the silence. "Someone's calling for you." Ellum didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the hills. "Not someone, something. But it's not the echo," she said. "You said the whisper's gone." He nodded once. "It is. This is something else. Another thread. Do we follow it?" Ellum finally turned to her, and in his expression there was no fear, only weariness. "Not yet," he said. "We go back. We tell Mara what we found. We rest." Vira hesitated. "And then?" He looked once more at the relay, the green light pulsing like a heartbeat left behind in the ruins of the old world. "Then we see if memory really dies when the whisper ends." They returned to the flats just before dusk, the valley drenched in copper light as the sun dipped low behind the ridgeline. Smoke from evening cookfires curled in soft spirals, and the scent of roasting maize and dried Brahmin meat hung in the air. Children darted between shadows, laughing in short bursts before vanishing into the folds of fabric and corrugated walls. The place felt unchanged, but for Elam, every shadow felt a little closer now, every corner a little more familiar, as though the memory chasing him had found its way here first and was waiting. Mara met them near the filtration tower. She listened as they described the relay, the signal, the word it repeated. When Elam mentioned the second message, the broken voice calling his name, her face didn't change. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had long suspected. "There are deeper networks than we understand," she said after a pause. "The old world's machines were built to remember. They archive, echo, evolve. Just because you silence one node doesn't mean the story ends. Sometimes it just finds another way to speak." Elam didn't argue. He understood now what he had denied in the reactor. Memory is not a voice that can be shut down. It is a root. It curls into soil, twists beneath time, and waits for rain. Mara rested a hand briefly on Vera's shoulder. "You both look tired. Get some rest. You can decide tomorrow what comes next." That night, as the wind pressed gently against the canvas above their cot, Elam lay awake longer than usual. Vera slept beside him, her breath slow and even, one arm curled beneath her head. He stared up at the familiar patch of sky through the tarp's tear, watching the stars drift behind strands of low cloud. The receiver lay silent beside his coat. He hadn't turned it off. He didn't need to. The signal was steady, like breath. Remember, he didn't need to decode it anymore. He knew what it meant. It wasn't the echo. It wasn't the whisper. It wasn't even Kayla. It was his own voice, caught in the folds of time, looping forward in the absence of grief. The part of him that had never forgiven himself, not for the retreat at Roanoke Bunker, not for Kayla's death, not for the way he had hidden from both. In the morning he rose before dawn. He didn't wake Vera. She would understand. He packed lightly, the revolver, a single water flask, a spare filter cartridge, and the receiver. He left the Brotherhood insignia behind, tucking it into her satchel with a folded scrap of paper that simply read, "Stay, if you choose." The bottle cap Kayla had carried still rested inside his coat, the metal cool against his chest. He did not remove it. Not yet. The road northwest was old, but familiar. He crossed 2 ridges before sunrise, skirting the edge of a radioactive sinkhole and bypassing the remnants of an old military checkpoint, where skeletal vertebrae lay tangled in razor wire. The landscape grew quieter the farther he went. Less wildlife, fewer ruins, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Midday brought him to the source of the signal. A buried facility, half collapsed, its entrance split open like a wound in the hillside. Ivy grew across the broken signage, but he could still make out the letters. Survivor Psych Echo, Sector 4B. Not a bunker, not a weapons cache, a psychological data repository, a place where minds had been studied, stored. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the sharp tang of old metal. Terminals blinked erratically, powered by a solar feed that had somehow survived. One remained active. He approached it slowly. The receiver pinged once, then the screen came to life. A single image flickered into focus, a photograph. Kayla, smiling in the light of an old farmhouse, eyes half closed, wind in her hair. Not a holotape, not a hallucination. A real photo, one he had never taken, logged under a data entry from a session dated weeks before her death. Another entry pulsed below it. Audio. He hesitated, then pressed play. Her voice was younger, lighter. "Elam, I don't know if you'll ever hear this. They said it might help, that it might store part of me in case things go bad. I didn't believe them, still don't. But I want you to know, I never blamed you. You did what you could. You always did. I just hope one day you can stop running." The file ended. Static returned. Elam stared at the screen for a long time. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out the cap, the one she had flicked into his hands the first day they'd met, joking that it was her last shred of wealth, the one he'd carried through 2 decades of wandering. He set it down beside the terminal. "No more running," he said quietly. He didn't erase the file. He didn't disable the signal. He left it broadcasting, soft, steady, unintrusive. A final memory, not to haunt, but to endure. When he returned to the flats 3 days later, Vera was waiting at the gate. She said nothing, just looked at him, and nodded. That night he slept without dreaming, and somewhere in the hills a single pulse continued its rhythm, whispering not for forgiveness or fear, but for the one thing the wasteland had almost forgotten how to offer: closure.